Welcome to Category Visionaries, the show dedicated to exploring exciting visions for the future from the founders who are on the front lines building it. In each episode, we'll speak with a visionary founder who's building a new category or reimagining an existing one. We'll learn about the problem they solve, how their technology works, and unpack their vision for the future. I'm your host, Brett Stapper, CEO of Frontlines Media. Now let's dive right into today's episode. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Category Visionaries. Today we're speaking with Matt Loszak, CEO and co-founder of Aalo, a nuclear energy company that's raised over $33 million in funding. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. Super excited. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Talk to us about what you're building today.
Awesome. Yeah, so we are Aalo Atomics, and we are building a 10 megawatt electric nuclear reactor that is small enough to fit in your garage or your backyard, and safe enough too, and yet can power anything from a small data center to a large city. And so we're really aiming to make factory manufactured nuclear reactors. Most of the reactors in the past were kind of very large and bespoke and took a long time to build. And what we're trying to do is be the first to build a fleet of nuclear reactors from a factory here in Austin and then shipped all around the country and one day the world.
What happened in your life that you ended up in the business where you're building nuclear reactors? It seems like a very, very specific, somewhat random industry to be in. How did you end up here?
Well, for me, it was kind of a combination of a bunch of different interests that I've always had. So for one thing, I studied engineering and physics in university, and I really at the time had no idea what that would kind of end up leading to. But I just thought it was really fascinating stuff, and I didn't really care what it would be used for. I just wanted to learn about how the universe works. And then also, all throughout my childhood, I was pretty interested in psychology and psychiatry, that kind of thing. And my parents are in that space, and so that's kind of what got me into that. And I think with nuclear, it's kind of this fascinating thing where it is half this technological challenge, but also this kind of other half of this psychological challenge. In my view, it's almost the most misunderstood technology in the world. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of been wrongly linked in people's minds to the weapon, the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb, when really it's so different. It's incredibly safe. Right now, it offers 20% of the energy, the electricity here in the US. It's totally clean. There's a lot of interesting kind of misconceptions around it. And so, that kind of combination of fascinating technical challenge mixed with fascinating psychological challenge is really what draws me to it. And I say, the last thing is that I grew up in Ontario, where it's kind of been 60 to 70% nuclear powered. And I used to have asthma as a kid growing up, and that went away when we transitioned from coal to nuclear. And so just kind of living that out and kind of being in this place where this incredible energy transition happened, much like in France, where the grid just kind of instantly over the course of 5 or 10 years became almost entirely clean, was just an incredible thing to live through. And for all those reasons, nuclear is a challenge that I've decided to dedicate the rest of my life to. So, yeah.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Germany shut down all of their nuclear reactors, or they were in the process of doing so. If that is accurate, what did Germany get wrong? And then what did France get right? Because you just mentioned France there. I always see France mentioned in articles. What did Germany get wrong? What did France get right?
Yeah. Well, it's been pretty fascinating to watch. It's kind of interesting as these different experiments in different countries can kind of show us what happens when some of these decisions are made. And in Germany, when they shut down their nuclear plants, their costs went up, their emissions went up, and a lot of heavy industries struggled because suddenly natural gas prices were going way up, and this became a real issue for them. So it's kind of a fascinating political challenge in Europe right now where even France, it's kind of funny, the whole goal here is to reduce emissions. And France has some of the lowest emissions in the whole region. And yet, because of kind of the politics around renewables, it's almost as though people are prioritizing renewables over prioritizing the ultimate goal, which is to lower emissions. And so France, despite having one of the cleanest grids in the region, was I'm not sure if this actually went through, but there was an attempt to mandate an increase in renewables deployment in France. And some of the people there were saying, well, kind of scratching their heads saying, why are we being mandated to do this when we already have such a clean grid? So it's a pretty fascinating, thing. It's an ongoing topic. There's a decent chance that Germany will turn some reactors back on at some point in the future. There are kind of the beginnings of momentum in that direction, but it's been a fascinating kind of experiment to watch.
Can you just turn them back on? Like, what does that look like?
Well, If they destroy the asset, then it would be difficult to turn back on. And in most cases, they do not destroy the asset. It's still kind of there. It's defunded. The employees are no longer there. But as we've seen in the US, there are some plants that are coming back online that have been shut down. And ultimately that probably today we'll talk a bunch of some of the new nuclear plants and new nuclear designs that are being considered. But the reality is if we're shutting down already built, already paid for nuclear plants that were just previously delivering so much clean energy and we're shutting those down, it doesn't really make sense to focus a lot on building new ones until we can get our act together and keep those plants open. So it's an interesting topic.
And what about in the US? If we just zoom out a little bit, how would you summarize the state of nuclear in the US?
So yeah, today nuclear powers 20% of the country in terms of electricity. It's totally clean energy. So contrary to natural gas even or coal, there's no emissions. People they see these large, what look like smokestacks. They're really actually cooling towers. And the only thing that's coming out of there is water vapor. So it's a pretty interesting energy source for those reasons. Today, the workforce for nuclear in the US is around 100,000 people, but been a recent report put out by DOE called the Liftoff Report, which is estimating that by 2050, there's going to be an additional 200 gigawatts of nuclear deployed in the country if we have any chance of hitting some of our clean energy targets. So that's a bit of what we've got to live up to. And in order to hit that, we've got to triple the nuclear workforce to 300,000 people. We've got to build a lot of more large plants, more smaller plants for various kind of size matching in various regions. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I think it's going to be an incredible era. And one way that we like to summarize this is in the 1950s and 60s, this is kind of like the first atomic age. So this is when most of these initial reactors in the US that currently power 20% of the country, this is when they were built, kind of from the 1950s to 1970s and 80s. And we can almost call that, the first atomic age. And one way to kind of measure that is how the experimentation happened at Idaho National Lab. And I think we'll get into this a bit later in the call. But there were 52 test reactors that were built for experimentation and learning, Idaho National Lab in Idaho, near Idaho Falls. And this was during that first atomic age. And then they reduced the number of reactors there all the way down to just 3. And so they turned off a lot of those. There were just 3 for decades in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. But now we kind of like to say that we're on the verge of this second atomic age because there's a few reactors that are getting built as we speak at Idaho National Lab to kind of usher in this new era of atomic energy. And one of the first ones is the Marvel reactor, which is the technology that we are kind of basing our reactor off of. So taking that technology, but scaling it up, making it more commercially focused, more economical. So that's kind of one of the most exciting epicenters of innovation in nuclear in the US right now is at Idaho National Lab. And we're excited to kind of be playing a part in that. And we'll talk more about exactly how we're doing that.
Now, any founder that's listening in is very familiar with the more kind of traditional startup go-to-market, building an MVP. When you're looking at a nuclear reactor, I'm guessing your go-to-market is a little bit different. Where do you even begin with bringing this type of technology to market?
Yeah, it's a great question. So what I've learned is that often in deep tech, the kind of go-to-market strategy is this kind of long-term play that often begins with an LOI or an MOU or something of that nature to kind of show that you are making real progress with some interested party. But the reality is not like a B2B SaaS company like my last company or something like hardware startup like Apple, where you're making a small product that you can kind of, prototype quickly and sell quickly and then iterate from there. You're really talking about this kind of massive endeavor. It's a long-term project, at least initially. The goal, of course, is to one day make this more like a product and less like a project. But the reality initially, it's just this kind of massively complex initiative that takes so many moving parts and pieces, and it takes years to get it all together. So effectively what an LOI or an MOU is doing in this kind of a deep tech space is saying, okay, on this time frame in year 1, here's what you expect to achieve. Here are the milestones you'll hit and de-risk things. And as you prove out your economics and your ability to make these things, you start to move towards legal contracts in the energy space. For example, it's called a PPA, a power purchase agreement. And these things just start to have more and more legal teeth as you de-risk things. So the go-to-market essentially is go out and talk to a ton of potential customers, see what they're interested in, help define the product with them, help define the business model with them, go through those gestations. And throughout the course of a year or two, you kind of move towards talking to a bunch who maybe don't want to buy your product. Some do, some move to an LOI, MOU. And then as you continue to de-risk the technology, that document gets more and more specific. Legally speaking, there's repercussions. And eventually we get to, in our space, what's called a PPA. So that's our approach to market.
This show is brought to you by Frontlines Media, a podcast production studio that helps B2B founders launch, manage, and grow their own podcast. Now, if you're a founder, you may be thinking, I don't have time to host a podcast. I've got a company to build. Well, that's exactly what we built our service to do. You show up and host, and we handle literally everything else. To set up a call to discuss launching your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. Now, back to today's episode. Now, are there any people in the industry, maybe established experts in nuclear, who disagree with your approach here? Like, do you have any haters, I guess would be another way to ask that question?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now, there's a pretty interesting debate in the nuclear space, which is, should we be building more large reactors, or should we be experimenting with these smaller, sometimes called advanced reactors? And it's kind of an interesting topic because the more conservative approach would be to say, okay, we've built a lot of reactors in the past. We went larger for a reason. These are often water-cooled reactors. They can be somewhat modular, although you can only get so modular when you're building something that is quite so massive as a, for example, gigawatt scale nuclear plant. But that's one narrative, is that we don't really need these smaller reactors for utility scale, at least. I think, most people would admit that as long as the economics can be hit, you can go after smaller markets with smaller reactors. But this kind of debate over what is the ultimate nuclear technology in terms of size and so on, a kind of form factor. So what we're saying is every plant that has been built in the past is bespoke. So there are all of these kind of almost one-off reactors, and the degree of modularity could drastically be improved. And so what we're really trying to do is be the first to deploy a small reactor gigafactory, like a micro reactor gigafactory that is producing these reactors that could fit in a shipping container, and that the entire plant can be shipped in somewhere between 10 and 15 kind of shipping container sized packages to any given site from a factory. And each reactor might be putting out 10 megawatts, but the factory itself could be producing gigawatts. And this is just simply something that has not been attempted before. And I think it's pretty hard to say definitively that that shouldn't be tried, considering that most reactors around the world today are kind of larger, because there's just so much evidence that points to this approach making a ton of sense. And, we can get more into the details there, but that is kind of one of the healthy tensions, one of the healthy debates that is pretty, pervasive in the space right now.
What about the marketing strategy? What does the marketing strategy and just high-level marketing program look like for, let's say, the next 12 months?
Well, marketing, I think, is a big area for improvement in the nuclear space. So it's something that for the industry as a whole has been kind of lacking, I'd say, in the past couple of decades. And what's been nice is you've seen kind of this uprising of so-called nuclear influencers who have come up and done a lot on Twitter and TikTok and YouTube to kind of spread the good word about nuclear, to explain to people a bunch of these interesting facts that people don't really realize. And I'll give you a couple of them that are kind of interesting. So one is, if your whole life was powered by nuclear energy, all the nuclear waste that you would produce would fit inside of a Coke can. So like picture something the size of your fist, right? Mm-hmm. And if you were to power your life with oil and gas, the amount of CO2 and kind of carbon emissions that you produce would kind of fill a city block. It would be massive. So it's kind of hard to fathom that energy density. And you put that another way, if you were to take all the nuclear waste from the entire history of US power production, so 50, 60 years, let's say 300 million people on average in that time frame, 20% of their electricity, all that nuclear waste, which again is portrayed as a huge issue, that would all fit on a football field. And if you just stacked like the naked pellets, it would be about 10 yards high, 10 feet high on a football field. And that's before you even take out. So by the way, when you have nuclear waste, most of, the mass in there is actually still usable fuel. So if you were to extract the usable fuel and be left with the true waste, which is kind of the fission products, it's kind of when you have these uranium atoms, they split in half, they split in different pieces. That stuff cannot be really used anymore. That would actually just be about 6 inches that would be just about 6 inches tall on a football field. All the waste from all the history of all nuclear power in the US. So there's things like that that I think are starting to enter the public narrative some more. And if we were doing this podcast 5 or 10 years ago, the audience might kind of be like, why, Brett, are you talking to this guy? Like, nuclear sucks. But I think now, like, it's becoming more and more common thanks to a lot of this. I wouldn't even call it marketing, but the storytelling and the kind of counter propaganda that's been going against nuclear to kind of reveal the facts and to tell people, look, nuclear waste is actually not really a problem. It's actually kind of a good thing. Everything has waste, and nuclear waste is the smallest, it's the least, it's the easiest to manage. And then you've got other things like the safety record. Nuclear statistically is just as safe as solar or wind. If you look at this weird statistic of deaths per unit energy generated. So there's lots of interesting narratives in the marketing of nuclear. And it's something that we want to do a lot more of as a company as well. So we intend to try to be extremely transparent. We actually just moved into a 40,000 square foot factory here in Austin to start to set up the pilot manufacturing line for our reactor. And we're going to do a lot of video content, a lot of more tweeting, everywhere. We're going to post about what the actual science is behind what we're doing. What are we building? How are we testing it? How are we making sure that it's safe? And how do we know that it's so awesome? And we're going to communicate that as best we can through storytelling. And actually, this is a bit of a rant, but one more thing I would say here is one of the challenges, and even it's kind of funny because I was just doing a bit of this myself, is if you only convey numbers, people don't care. You have to convince people with stories and emotion. And I think that's a big part of what's been missing in nuclear today. So that's a lot of thoughts on this. There's a lot more work to be done, but it's a pretty fascinating challenge, and we're excited to tackle it.
Who's behind all of the anti-nuclear propaganda? Or, who stands to lose here? Is it like the traditional energy producers? Like, who's afraid of nuclear?
Well, the answer, I think, would have been different if you asked me 20, 30, 40 years ago versus now. So there is still a bit of an anti-nuclear movement, although it's really waned in terms of its strength and their numbers. So in the 1970s and 80s, there was kind of a few major factions. One was people who were trying to get rid of atomic weapons, and they were trying to basically throw out the baby with the bathwater. And they were trying to lump in all things nuclear, including the energy source. And without any pushback, that could just happen, right? And at the time, people were like, well, is climate change or global warming really a concern? 70s and 80s, it wasn't really as much of a concern to people at that point. And so they were saying, okay, well, that's fine. There wasn't much pushback to getting rid of nuclear. The benefits, the cleanness of it, and so on were not as apparent as being necessary. And so that was one part. The other was when scientists discovered splitting the atom. Scientists all immediately knew that this could be either used as our either ultimate energy source or the ultimate weapon. I mean, it's just human nature. When you see something with such incredible energy potential, it's kind of like the closest thing to a real world superpower. It's like Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And initially, humanity invested a lot of money into the weapon side of that. But the reality is the energy source is this totally separate thing that happens to use the same underlying physics. And people were just trying to abolish both those things at once. And I think that is one of the biggest mistakes in the history of humanity. And then the other side is there was a lot of psychology amongst those scientists that they were trying to place bets. When will this energy source, nuclear, take over, 50%, 80%, 100% of the grid? And some scientists thought, in the 60s, that by the year 2000, 100% of our energy would come from nuclear. And the issue is the oil and gas industry at the time really didn't want that to happen. And there's been some evidence that there was some conspiracy theorist over here, but there's been a little bit of evidence of some pushback from the oil and gas industry at that time in various forms. And, there's some good documentation of this online. But in any case, the funny thing is today, you don't really see that anymore. In fact, some oil and gas companies, they want to diversify because they look at it and they say, okay, well, yes, we have all these assets that are already paid off that are good for utilizing oil and gas, but increasingly there's more and more ESG concerns, there's more and more clean energy concerns, emissions concerns, and all these different kind of vectors, all things point towards us thinking and saying, maybe we should move off of oil and gas before we use it all up. Maybe it's not the best idea to just put all that carbon back into the air. And so even now, you do see that things have transitioned a bit. And I don't think that there's really any more that same pushback from a corporate level, even at these oil and gas companies. And so essentially now is this incredible time because there's all these positive forces pushing in nuclear's favor. There's less and less resistance. A lot of those factions from the 70s and 80s are much smaller or are people who are now retired or have passed on. And so I think it's just an incredible opportunity for humanity to do right by this incredible energy source and do right by those scientists who discovered what they thought was the ultimate energy source, 70 years ago, and see if we can actually use that to do incredible good for humanity on a go forward basis. So we're pretty excited to be working on it.
This show is brought to you by the Global Talent Co., a marketing leader's best friend in these times of budget cuts and efficient growth. We help marketing leaders find, hire, vet, and manage amazing marketing talent for 50 to 70% less than their US and European counterparts. To book a free consultation, visit globaltalent.co.
Now, I want to go back a little bit to the marketing tactics that you were talking about. You had shared some ideas there. The one I want to ask about specifically is Twitter, or I should say X. I see you have about 10,000 followers there. You have some bangers. I like the tweet with the donut in front of an American flag. The question there is, how do you think about the impact of Twitter? That's something that I see a lot of founders debate. Is Twitter worth the time investment that it takes? What are your thoughts there? Given you're actively tweeting so much, I have to imagine you're getting value from it.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty incredible tool. We've been starting with Twitter. We want to do more on TikTok and YouTube and everything, LinkedIn. These kind of, in my view, have a different purpose, a different advantage. We actually did meet our seed stage investors through Twitter. So in a very real sense, it's been very helpful for us. But the way I think about it is Twitter is a great way to reach new audiences. It's a great way to engage with both proponents and opponents. So people who maybe disagree with your viewpoint. And if I think of some new narrative or some new way of framing things, putting it out on Twitter is so awesome because then you get instant feedback and response on, does this narrative resonate? Is this narrative flawed? People can tell you if you're wrong on something, or they can double down and support if they think it's actually a beautiful way of framing something. And so I think it's just an incredible tool for what we're doing because when you're trying to kind of en masse change public perception and public opinions on something, having a tool like that gives you an instant response to, are your ideas, are your memes, are your, the way that you're framing things, are they resonating with people? Yes or no? It's just great to have that tight feedback loop because then you can use that both in subsequent use online or maybe in discussions in person with different people, whether it's investors or possible customers and so on. So I love the tool for that. And then I think also Twitter really highlights the importance of understanding how to write a good hook. So when I first started tweeting, there'd be times when I'd spend maybe like a couple hours writing this like substance behind a thread. And then if the first tweet doesn't hook people, all your work goes to waste. So it really kind of highlights the importance of being able to write a opening that makes people say, oh, I don't know the answer to that. Let me click in, or I disagree, or I think this is crazy. I'll click in. And I think that's kind of this important skill that maybe people underestimate, but probably is quite helpful in lots of walks of life, including, fundraising, getting customers, hiring people. Like if you are able to even speak in real time, and I think maybe Elon, or like we were talking about before the show started, like people like Trump who just verbally find these hooks that just capture people for better or worse, then I think that's just an incredibly powerful tool. So yeah, I love Twitter for that.
For your tweets that you've put out, what's your most popular one?
Oh, mine. Yeah. So my most successful tweet was there was this kind of meme going around where people were using ChatGPT when it first got the image capabilities, when they created DALL-E, to make increasingly ridiculous images of something. And I thought, hey, why not make like increasingly ridiculous image of someone realizing how insanely cool nuclear energy is? And that might sound kind of, nerdy or silly, but it kind of like just looks funny when you see it if you look up this thread. And yeah, I think it got a couple million views and it went kind of viral. So yeah, it resonated. And I think it just underscores the importance of, if you want to get your message across, being able to speak the meme language. And I guess Elon is probably the classic example of this, of just being the meme lord, like someone who is able to just so easily conjure these memes that are, and I don't just mean like a funny GIF. I mean like a way of encapsulating an idea in a way that is just so immensely memorable and shareable and sticks in your mind I mean, that's just an insane skill set. And it's something that, I want to get better at. And I think will be super important for us in our journey at Aalo. But anyway, that was my most successful tweet so far.
That's awesome. We'll dig that up and we'll link to it in the show notes. Now, let's talk a little bit about the recent funding round. So I know a couple of weeks ago, you announced the Series A. Talk to us about going from seed to Series A. What was that journey like? What were the big milestones you were after? And what did you learn from that journey?
Well, so for me, I was a previous founder. So I'd already done one startup that was kind of like TikTok before TikTok. It was called JamCam. We got to 1 million downloads. We did a Maroon 5 partnership. There's a whole scandalous story of the battle with TikTok, used to be called Musical.ly versus what we were doing. But that was my first startup. It was difficult to make money, but it was a good learning experience around building product and so on. My next venture it's called Humi. It's HR, payroll, and benefit software for Canadian small businesses. And that's much better. So we scaled it to 150 people, raised about 50 million in venture capital. So that kind of, having that background experience kind of helped raise the seed round. And we raised that seed round for Aalo about a year ago. That was 6.26 million. And then at that point, the company was essentially just an idea and, kind of a story. And throughout the past year leading into our Series A, which we've just closed, we obviously did a lot of hiring. We did a lot of de-risking on the technical design side of things, a lot of de-risking on the customer front. And across all those dimensions, it enabled us to just close this $27 million Series A. And so, with this, we've just moved into this 40,000 square foot factory space in Austin, where we're going to be setting up the pilot line for this small reactor gigafactory. So this will be kind of the pilot scale version of that. It's where we'll build our first reactor, which we're intending to deploy at Idaho National Lab. We have a siting MOU for that at Idaho National Lab. And so the next 12 to 24 months will be a really exciting period of, expanding the team and starting to actually build some of the non-nuclear prototype materials, components, and assembling that into a complete prototype, and then ultimately building the first true nuclear version at Idaho National Lab. So it'll be a really, really exciting, next year or two. And we're super honored that our investors and backers believed in us enough to give us this opportunity.
What advice would you have for founders who are building deep tech when it comes to fundraising? What would be that number one piece of advice that you'd give them?
Well, I think something that someone told me that's been quite helpful is really the fundraising never really ends. So I think not thinking of it as, we're doing this round, we're doing that round, but more just establishing relationships with investors and continually keeping them updated on all of your progress and building that relationship and strengthening it constantly over time, I think is really the name of the game. And then also, I think something that's kind of interesting, obviously you have to push in all dimensions. You got to make good customer traction, good technical de-risking, good recruiting. You have to demonstrate you can operate a business by understanding, how to create a good financial model and predict your economics and all this kind of stuff. But I think the way that all comes together is it's helpful if, as you raise a round, you have to kind of balance the psychology of it. So saying too early that you're raising a round or going out to market in a difficult time to raise funds can make life difficult for you. And so I think playing that psychology as you talk to investors and being cautious about how you frame the position of the fundraiser, the timing of the fundraise, and so on can be ultimately make or break for a round. And so, on a go forward basis, we're just going to be constantly talking to investors. And, we have our targets for when we intend to raise the next round. But I think it'll very much be this organic process based on just a ton of active conversations, as opposed to some kind of concerted 1 month hyperdrive effort towards a fundraise. So that's how I think about it. Maybe different things work for different people, but that's going to be our approach.
And if you think ahead to the next year, what are you working on that you're really excited about? Any projects that are in development that you can tease us about?
Yeah, totally. So the first one is our non-nuclear reactor. So this is essentially like a full-scale version of the reactor itself. And we're going to be building that over the next 6 to 12 months. And with that, we're going to be able to test a few things. So we're going to put it together in the factory. And the factory is almost a product in and of itself. So the effort that we put in here is not just around the reactor design, but it's also in the way that that factory line comes together. That is essentially a product itself as well. And after we build the reactor once, we're actually planning to take it apart and then put it back together again and see if we did that faster. because a core part of our DNA is not just having a reactor design and building it once, but it's being able to repeatedly build these reactors faster and faster in a more and more economical way. So that'll be a fantastic thing. We're also going to be doing some testing of sodium. So with our reactor design, liquid metal is the coolant, and it's an incredible coolant. It takes the heat away very fast. It allows the reactor to be very compact. But we're going to do some experiments with liquid sodium to show the public, what does this look like when you slice open a pipe and it's got hot sodium in it? Or what does this look like when sodium reacts with water? And we'll show the various kind of reactions that can take place and build the trust that way in a very transparent way. So that'll be interesting. And ultimately, we're aiming to hit the same timeline that the Marvel team did with Idaho National Lab and the Marvel reactor. So in roughly 18 to 24 months, we are aiming to achieve the regulatory approval to build the first real reactor at the National Lab. This is the Aalo X, the experimental reactor that we're building. So across that and the non-nuclear prototype construction and the creation of the factory pilot line, there's a lot of pretty cool projects that we're working on. And yeah, it's going to be a pretty incredible rest of 2024 and 2025.
Amazing, man. I love it. This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed this conversation. We're going to have to wrap here. Before we do, if there's any founders who are listening in that want to follow along with your journey, or maybe some talent that's listening in that wants to join the team and be part of this mission, where should we send them? Where should they go?
Amazing. Yeah, thanks for having me. And it'll be our website, www.aalo.com, aalo.com. You can also email us, contact@aalo.com, or just tweet at me. My Twitter or my X is at Matt Loszak, MattLoszak. And yeah, really appreciate you having me on, Brad.
No problem at all. Keep in touch.
Cheers.
This episode of Category Visionaries is brought to you by Frontlines Media, Silicon Valley's leading podcast production studio. If you're a B2B founder looking for help launching and growing your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. And for the latest episode, search for Category Visionaries on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.